Welcome to another episode of our weekly podcast here at Calvary Chapel, Johnson County. My name is Jared Clements, and currently we are working our way through the book of James, and actually we're now 2 episodes away from completing our journey. Last week, you will remember that James continued to speak about the pride of man when he spoke about how man tends to plan his steps and his days without a thought of what God might want or have for them. And really, that's a shame, because that means that when we're living that way, that there's a great possibility of missing out on God's will for our lives. Remember, His plans are always best. He knows how to govern our steps, and as such, we should continually be submitting to Him and looking for Him to lead us. And then James had some more words for the rich, admonishing them not to take advantage of others, reminding them that the Lord of heaven's armies heard the cries of those that were taken advantage of, and that their riches were corruptible, and certainly that is true. The riches of this world might bring about temporary satisfaction, but they sure can't be taken into eternity. This week, James will start to kind of wrap things up as he gives us several things to think about. If you'll look with me at verses 7 and 8, which says, "Therefore be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, waiting patiently for it until it receives the early and latter rain. You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand." Well, remember that James has just spoken about how the rich condemn and murder the just. They take advantage of those living for truth. And this is why James says that if you're on the receiving end of those things, that you need to be patient until the coming of the Lord. And that's a good admonition for all of us. We need to be patient until the Lord comes. It's interesting that James uses the word patient, for if you remember back in chapter 1, when he was speaking of trials, he said that they specifically produce patience in our lives. So while we wait and grow in patience, we do endure difficulty, but our difficulty is not without an end result. And that end result, that end result happens when Jesus comes back. And one day He will return, for His word promises He will do so. I know it's hard to be patient. It's hard to live with eternity in mind, and yet as we do so, we know that there is a blessing that awaits us. James even gives us an example to think about. He uses the farmer this time and how they plant the seeds in the earth, and then they have to wait patiently for the early and latter rains. All the farmer can really do is to plant the seeds. Then comes the waiting before the final harvest. And I think that's how it can often feel for us. Often we can feel like there's no end in sight on our journey to heaven, and yet the crops keep growing. And even so, the Lord will one day return and make all things right once again. One day we'll enjoy that harvest in our lives, that eternal harvest that we're waiting for as we spend eternity with the Lord. James says that we should establish our hearts while we wait. And that always reminds me of a mighty tree that has grown for many years, and how the roots go deep. And when the wind and the storms pound against that tree, it remains. And I think that's how we need to live. We need to build our lives on the foundation of Jesus Christ. We need to be listening to His word and applying it to our lives, and also doing that which He has said. Along the way, we might be taken advantage of, we may be mistreated, but always remember the coming of the Lord is at hand, just around the corner, and that should be what governs and directs our lives. In verse 9, James says, "Do not grumble against one another, brethren, lest you be condemned. Behold, the judge is standing at the door." Well, in our flesh, And I think you'll agree with me, it is always easy to grumble against one another. We see someone doing things a certain way and we immediately judge them. We laugh at them in our minds and hearts, or we come against them even by speaking to another brother about them. James says, stop it, knock it off, don't do that. And that's something we really need to strive for is, hey, let's stop backbiting and cutting down each other, and let's look to build each other up instead. Notice that James says, don't do this lest you be condemned. And we're reminded of the words Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount when he said, judge not lest you be judged. And certainly a grumbling heart kind of breeds or produces more grumbling hearts. Bad attitudes tend to rub off on each other. If you've ever been in a work environment where nobody's happy, you know it can be miserable. Much easier to have a good attitude when those around you have a good attitude as well. And like I said, grumbling will only bring about more grumbling. It just spreads like wildfire. Remember, the judge is at the door. One day we'll be judged even as believers, and I'm unsure how that will roll out, for clearly we will be given entrance to heaven based upon one thing and one thing only, and that's whether we have received Jesus Christ in our hearts and lives or we have rejected him. But having said that, the Bible also teaches we'll receive some measure of judgment based on what we've done with our time, talent, resources, and efforts. All right, verse 10 says, my brethren, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord as an example of suffering and patience. So James now reminds his readers of the prophets and the things that they endured in their lives as an example. And really, this kind of reminded me of what we find in Hebrews chapter 11. If you read through that chapter, I always call it the Hall of Faith. It's those that have gone before us who have stood in the faith, who have endured, who have patiently suffered through things. And it's always an encouragement to remember those who have gone before us and who are willing to go through quite difficult things. Jeremiah was a prophet that went through complete rejection in his life. No one is really recorded as having listened to him all that much when he spoke. He found himself in the stocks of the city at one point, in a dry cistern in another one, and his life was threatened on multiple occasions, and yet he remained faithful. I think of Elijah, the prophet, who spoke incredible words for the Lord, and yet was rejected. He had to flee for his life at times, and the wicked Jezebel said, hey, you're going to be a dead man. And Elijah actually, unfortunately, he ran at that point in his life. But certainly Elijah was a prophet that stood and endured. You think of Daniel and his friends and the persecution that they endured on multiple occasions, and yet they remained steadfast in their faith, refusing to bow the knee to wickedness. Listen to what Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 and 2 says. It says, therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. So those that have gone before us certainly did endure. They were established in heart, and they had their eyes on the goal set before them. And we should learn from their examples. In verse 11, James decides to talk about someone specifically, and it's Job. Verse 11 says, indeed, we count them blessed who endure. You have heard of the perseverance of Job and seen the end intended by the Lord, that the Lord is very compassionate and merciful. So we can all look at the things the people of the Bible went through, and we count them as blessed. And beyond that, really anyone that endures great difficulty is seen as an example, someone to learn from, someone to follow. And so, hey, if you have someone in your life that is like that, that they just have been through some really tough times, I encourage you to learn from them, listen to the things they say, look at their relationship with Jesus and learn from that. So Job was a man that persevered, and he saw what it was the Lord was working into his life. Of course, we all know Job, as in just a short amount of time, all he had was taken. His kids all died, his possessions, his livestock were lost. Even his own wife told him, she said, Job, why don't you just curse God and die? And then during that time, Job's body started to fall apart. He had boils all over himself, and all of those things had to be terrible. And then we have a record of 3 friends that showed up, and really all they said was negative stuff about him and tore him down and told him he was a sinner and a failure. And, just multiple things happened in his life that were difficult and very hard to go through. But Job endured. He held on to the Lord. He cried out, saying at one point that he wished there was one that could be a mediator between him and God. And certainly that reminds us of what Jesus has accomplished for us. And what did Job discover as he endured? He discovered the authority of God, the mercy of God, the love of God in his life, and by the end of the book of Job, we're told that all had been restored to him, and even more. So Job is a great example. In this world, as believers in Christ, we may endure great difficulty. We may need to have great patience in our lives, but remember all along that the Lord has a plan, that He will work in your life, He will minister to you in ways you never thought or imagined, and at the end you will see that the Lord has been compassionate and merciful to you. That will be the end result as you persevere. Certainly you and I, we deserve the worst, but the Lord Jesus gives us the best. And then verse 12, as James gives what I think is maybe just a separate instruction here, he says, "But above all, my brethren, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or with any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no, no, lest you fall into judgment." So sometimes we can have a problem keeping this simple admonishment. How often do we tell a brother, "Hey, I'm going to pray for you, brother," and then we see them again and our hearts are broken because we realize we've forgotten. And that's certainly something I try to do right away now. If I tell someone I'm going to pray, then I'm bringing that before the Lord, even as I'm speaking to them, that, "Hey, Lord, I want to see your work and I don't want to forget." But how often do we say we will do things and then we don't really follow through on that? James says, don't swear on things. Don't make great promises to others and then not keep them. Instead, he says, simply be a person that follows through with that which you have said you will do. If you make a commitment, then keep it. And don't change your plans because something better comes along or something you might enjoy more. Have confidence that the things you commit to do, that God has called you to that. And perhaps that goes hand in hand with how we make our plans and the need to submit all things to His great care. So if you make a decision, then have confidence and say, "Hey, the Lord's called me to do that." Other things might come up, but I'm going to say, "Hey, I've made a commitment. I've told somebody, yes, I'm going to do this, so I'm going to do it." We should be a people that are reliable and faithful, and understand as you do that, the things that the Lord has placed on your plate and the things that you're agreeing to do. Understand that the Lord is looking for those that will be faithful to do that which has been placed in their lives. Faithfulness is a great characteristic to have in our lives as the Lord works in us and through us. And certainly we can look at Jesus and say, "Hey, He has been faithful to me in my life, and I want to be faithful to others as well." All right, well, that's where we're stopping for today. May the Lord bless you, And I pray that the simple washing of His Word through these podcasts, these devotionals that we go through on a weekly basis, that they would be a blessing to all of us. God bless.